Good evening. My name is Kate Shimanensky, and I'm an experienced matter at the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and I'm happy to see that so many of you have shown up for tonight's UW Showcase Lecture. I want to give a special thank you and welcome to our Brown County alumni and anyone else who is tuning in to this live webcast tonight. I'm happy to announce that this is going to be the first of many lectures that we are going to webcast at the Wisconsin Alumni Association. So not just everyone who's here in Madison can enjoy the lectures, but also everyone around the world, our alumni and friends everywhere. I'd like to thank the Capitol Lakes Retirement Community for sponsoring this lecture series. The UW Showcase Lecture Series highlights the best of UW-Madison and shows the Wisconsin idea in action. If you're watching from home tonight, please let us know what you think and send any questions that you might have for our speaker, Paul Robbins, to webcast@uwalumni.com. Thank you for joining us this evening, and right now I'd like to introduce you to Pat Cornwell.
It's nice to see so many familiar faces here. Puts me at ease. My husband Dan and I live here at Capitol Lakes, as some of you know. We are delighted to welcome you to tonight's showcase lecture. Along with those of us here in Madison, we also welcome our audience in the Green Bay area and anyone else who is joining us via the web. Welcome to you all. It's my privilege to be able to introduce tonight's speaker, Paul Robbins, Director of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. I have met Paul, and I assure you that you are about to meet a man with extraordinary vision and enthusiasm for building a sustainable future, maybe substantial too. I'm also privileged to introduce Paul because he directs the Nelson Institute, a 42-year-old organization named for U.S. Senator and Wisconsin Governor Gaylord Nelson. As you surely know, Gaylord was the founder of Earth Day back in 1970, the same year the Institute was founded. But as you may not know, Gaylord Nelson was also my boss. I had the privilege to serve on his staff when he was governor, all 4 years. I know Gaylord would have reveled in the renewed attention that so many of us, more diverse people, organizations, and communities, are placing on our stewardship of natural resources and the critical issues facing the global environment. To have so many people come together to engage in this discussion is exactly the kind of thing he always promoted. Thank you for taking time to do that this evening. It's a practice that the Nelson Institute has become widely known for, bringing people together to discuss contemporary environmental issues, and a reason why Dan and I have long supported the Nelson Institute. With that, let me introduce Paul Robbins. Paul joined the Nelson Institute as director in August after having served as director of the School of Geography and Development at the University of Arizona. Here at Wisconsin, he leads the Institute's extraordinary programs in interdisciplinary environmental research, education, and community engagement. That includes 4 research centers, more than 700 students, and 150 affiliated faculty members. Paul is here tonight to present and discuss what keeps you awake at night, daunting environmental challenges and surprising opportunities. Please join me in welcoming Paul Robbins.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming out. Thank you to the Alumni Association for hosting. Thank you to the Gaylord Nelson Institute, and especially thank you to Pat. It is an honor to be introduced by someone who knew and worked with Gaylord Nelson. Gaylord Nelson's desk, his senatorial desk, they get to keep them when they're done at the Senate. They ship the darn thing back here, and it sits in my office I'm not allowed to use it, not to worry. It sits at the other end of the office, looking at me every morning saying, "What the heck have you done today?" Right? And so I'm always greatly inspired and profoundly intimidated by the legacy of Gaylord Nelson, and I hope that what I described tonight can live up in some small way to the vision that Gaylord Nelson laid down both in his time with the state of Wisconsin, but also as a national and international figure for the environment. So let me ask a question. When the environment was last in the news that you remember, what was it about? What was the story in the news about? Anything about the environment? Sandy, global warming, what else? Anything else? BP. Yeah, that's pretty timely just today. Al Gore. Well, that'll jump the, okay. So what is it really? It's essentially, in a sense, this is not working. We might imagine the environment as a giant disaster movie. In other words, one horrific event following another. And it's a narrative that is both compelling and somewhat seductive and very, very depressing, that we can think about and only think about the environment as a condition essentially of hopelessness and not hopefulness. And you'll remember this movie, The Day After Tomorrow, right? A huge wave comes and devours New York City, and then everything gets locked in ice. It's very depressing, and then we all flee to Mexico. So the problem is that story, however bizarre, is at some level in a trend towards concern that we would have to pay some attention to. These are, this is an image from 2 weeks ago. This is from Sandy. So Hurricane Sandy is very, very real. These are people's homes. They were above water when this started. This isn't Bangladesh. This is Long Island and New York. Oh. This last year, if you had a chance to travel the state and take a look at the corn crop, we had a drought here following several seasons of Midwest drought that devastated the corn crop and other crops across Wisconsin and the rest of the region. It was a terrible, terrible season for agriculture in the central part of the state. Corn prices are through the roof with huge implications for the economy. These are images in the center here from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers of Florida. We've had record flooding over the last few years, both in Florida and elsewhere. These are obviously real and pressing trends. And over here on the right, I just moved from Arizona, where the wildfire season was quite simply out of control last year. And it topped a year before when everybody said, surely it can't get any worse. And yet it did. 2011, I believe, was recognized by, is it the UN, Steve, as the year of the most extreme weather, but that was before they had a chance to get to 2012. Now, weather is not climate. A weather event can happen no matter what is happening to the climate. But in a trend where global warming occurs, extreme weather events are more predictable. They're more common, and they're more severe. You can see the melting of the ice pack in the Arctic currently, such that sea lanes are opening. You will be able to take sea passage from New York City to Tokyo, not through the Panama Canal, but over the northern part of the globe. The Russian government staked a flag on the shore, off the shore of the Arctic to claim oil and natural gas rights, which are now accessible to them, owing to the opening of the Arctic ice. So bad news, right? Sounds like bad news. And there are plenty of human-made disasters which may not have anything to do with global warming, which include this footage here. This picture here is from the Gulf oil spill, which we've had enough time to forget about, except for BP hasn't forgotten about it quite yet. And then here, the Fukushima disaster related to a tsunami, not a climate-driven event at all, but driven to risks and hazards that are created by certain kinds of energy choices made in vulnerable places. The point is, it would be very, very easy, and I think there would be reason to imagine the environment as a long, slow disaster movie. Katrina, the Gulf oil spill, Sandy, and then it's just a question of waiting for some next awful thing. And these things are, of course, I would say very real and very pressing. And what they mark is a sea change, quite literally, in the global environmental system. That we've entered what is called now, by some members of the scientific community, the Anthropocene. And that term refers to a geologic era in which human beings have a remarkable influence over how the globe functions, how the climate works, how the land cover operates, how the global ecology and circulations of things like nutrients occur. That we, in other words, it's Anthropocene, anthro meaning human, Anthropocene being the era, essentially, of human influence. The interesting thing about the Anthropocene is huge human influence without significant levels of human control. Things are happening outside of human control but as a result of human influence. This is a pretty intimidating kind of picture. And what I want to suggest, though, is that this is not the end of the world, but it is a changing world. And there's a way to think about, address, and move forward without a kind of disaster movie scenario playing out in your mind. Acknowledging then that global temperatures are rising, and this is a time series here from 1880 to 2000. You can stretch these numbers back over much, much earlier periods, tens of thousands or millions of years, and you can see we're in an anomalously warm period. And this trend absolutely tracks against the release of greenhouse gases through industrial processes driven by human economy. That is, we put stuff in the air which changes the way the climate works. And entirely apart from climate, we are looking at a world where I think we can predictably say we'll top out at about 9 to 10 billion people. Maybe that's not too many, maybe it's too many, that's about how many we would expect. By 2050, global populations will probably level off, but you're talking about a lot of people. And almost all of them will live in cities. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 75% of people lived outside of cities. By the end of this century, the majorities of populations in India, China, and certainly the United States for many decades will live in cities. That is a total change in the way we consume things, the way we use things, the way we manage our lifestyles, and the way we interact with the environment. It's a big deal. So there's some pretty real challenges here, and they're a little scary, and they keep me awake at night. Can we adapt to a changing climate? Can we feed the world's growing population? Can everyone eat? Can you develop clean, sustainable energy sources to meet the kind of large-scale demand that we're seeing? What do we do with all of our waste? And how do we ensure that human health can be met in a condition of global climate change? These are pretty scary challenges. The interesting thing is that while many people wring their hands and worry, a lot of other people are busy. They're hard at work adapting to some of this change. If you look, Chicago, the city of Chicago has a climate action plan. The federal government does not have a climate action plan, but the city of Chicago does. The city of Seattle does. There's something in force called the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. These are cities all over the United States that decided, well, you know, if the seas are going to rise, if you're in Seattle, it's a very practical problem. You got to think about how to handle the waterfront. You got to think about how to handle shipping. These are basic economic questions. And Gaylord Nelson himself was well known for saying that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment and not the other way around. That's Gaylord Nelson. So if you're worried about the environment, if you're worried about the economy, you're worried about the environment. So people are already thinking about how to adapt, including some federal efforts at the US Department of Interior. And I would point out this impact and adaptation plan that was put together by scholars at the University of Wisconsin for what we should think about for the next 50 years of climate change in Wisconsin. How do we manage the dairy industry? How do we think about recreation and tourism? How do we think about forestry? Bread and butter stuff in Wisconsin in a changing world. So rather than be paralyzed by a disaster scenario, we're in a position to at least think about what kind of future we want to see and how we're going to live in it. So there's evidence that we're smart enough, if we can't get in front of it, to at least run along behind it before it gets away. And instances of local innovation are evident everywhere in the world. This is a quick snapshot of the city of Freiburg in Germany. Freiburg is I don't know if everybody knows this, sister city to Madison, Wisconsin. Freiburg is quite remarkable. Freiburg has a fully developed solar energy economy, and almost all of the waste, I believe all of the waste stream is now metabolized. It's the waste stream that comes out of people's homes, the waste stream that comes out of restaurants, the waste stream that comes out of factories, into giant anaerobic digesters, huge machines that, without burning any of this waste, turn it to energy on the grid. And there's one of these digesters from Freiburg right now for the Green Bay audience up at UW Oshkosh. Up at UW Oshkosh, where they're taking tons of leaf waste, food waste, and turning it into energy. Last year, in 2011, the city of Madison picked up 15,000 tons of leaves. I know that seems like a lot. That's a lot of leaves. This is the first time I've lived in the Midwest in about 25 years, and I had to rake this year. Arizona's a lot easier. No leaves, really much simpler lifestyle. And what happens with these leaves? They're dumped unceremoniously across town, where they pile up and belch out greenhouse gases to nobody's benefit. throw these things in a giant anaerobic digester, as they do in Freiburg, and you capture those greenhouse gases. They do not go back into the atmosphere, and they turn into positive energy, which can be burned to, or that can be exercised to heat homes, power streetcars along the way, and you've got an entirely bicycle-driven economy. The point is that there are instances of innovation. This is an entire city that, through its own political will, turned its economy green. Now, you might say, well, that's Europe, right? They're a little weird in Europe. Take the case of Greensburg, Kansas, devastated, laid utterly flat several years ago by a record-breaking string of tornadoes across the Midwest. When the people of Greensburg woke up after those tornadoes came through, there was no Greensburg. And the people weren't going to go away, so they had to rebuild. They chose to rebuild the entire city with green infrastructure. That is, infrastructure that will manage its waste, that will power itself from the sun, that will deliver its transportation options. It's like I'm being punished if I step the wrong place. That will transform the economy utterly by rebuilding green. So it's not just Europe. We have instances of real innovation and creativity. Here's a weird example. Dow Chemicals, just between you and me, is not really known as, let's say, a clean green company historically. All right? If you go back to the 1960s and 70s, better living through chemistry. To be fair, my father edited Chemical Week, so maybe it's just a father-son war. But Dow Chemicals, not notorious as a great green industrial power. And yet, here is Dow Chemicals partnering with the Nature Conservancy to set aside, protect, and restore tens of thousands of acres along the Gulf Coast. Now, why would they do that? Would they do that because they've got a heart of gold or a heart of green? They do it for very practical economic reasons. The entire infrastructure that they've assembled along the seacoast in New Jersey, in Texas, and along the Gulf Coast in Louisiana depends entirely on not being flooded out, overwhelmed by storm surge, or experiencing the kinds of disastrous things that we saw very recently with Sandy, and certainly before that with Katrina. Katrina was the wake-up call to Dow Chemicals. That, in other words, it's in their own pocketbook interest to think about restoring large areas of land that they had, admittedly, over time, participated in destroying previously. That's a remarkable transformation. And maybe you're not ready to give them the Green Medal of Goodness quite yet, the Good Housekeeping Award, but it is a model for the future. It's something to think about in the same way that we think about Freiburg or Greensburg. The Lyme Timber Company, with a 67,000 acre, closer to home, acre easement up in the northern part of Wisconsin, has turned a working forest into one dedicated to conservation where timber still comes off the land. That there are still jobs extracting trees from this Lyme easement, part of the tradition of forestry that's right on the state flag of Wisconsin, while at the same time maintaining biodiversity over long periods, over 100 years, over 200 years. Easements that, in other words, maintain the land in biodiversity while still keeping jobs on the land. That's a success story in the face of what is otherwise, I would say, a somewhat depressing a look into the future. So what do all these things have in common? And here's a picture of it. This is a picture of the easement here. This is not, in other words, pristine wilderness. This is worked land. This is land that people, this is working, living, Anthropocene land. That is places where people have left their mark, but where biodiversity, forests, and other kinds of ecological opportunities are allowed to blossom through a kind of remarkable bargain. So, if we imagine an urban future that's green, if we imagine an industrial future that is somehow making a bargain with the environment, if we imagine a change in the way we think about conservation to not just be about saving smaller and smaller pieces of what's left, to advancing forward to create something sustainable everywhere, conservation everywhere, what would that look like? What would we need to know? What would we need to do? What kinds of science would be required to do this differently than we've done before? And I'm just going to talk briefly about 3 research projects that I've been involved in that are scientific projects, but they are really geared at pretty common problems faced in the Anthropocene management of the environment. One, how do people behave and what do they choose to do? When you think about why would somebody choose to recycle or not recycle? When you think about why somebody would choose to, as I'll show you, use chemicals or not use chemicals, what would motivate somebody to change their behavior? It's the million-dollar question. It's not an easy one to answer. The second one, how can we, when you got 9 or 10 billion people on the planet, how can we live with and make space for other species that are not people? All those other species. Everything else is not people. And finally, how do we learn to adapt to new risks and hazards on the fly? And what do I mean by on the fly? I mean that things are happening so quickly in terms of environmental change that we're going to have to learn how to do things very, very quickly. And people are not, really good at learning new stuff very quickly. Governments are especially slow at learning new things. And companies, it's taken Dow Chemicals a long time to come up with a new model. So how can we operate in a more quickly changing world? Those are 3 difficult questions. I'm going to give you 3 hints at the answer. One of our research projects was on the American lawn. We wanted to know why and when people use lots and lots of lawn chemicals, meaning fertilizers, insecticides, herbicides. When do people do it? We did a national survey of homeowners. We spent a lot of time interviewing people. We studied the lawn chemical industry. And here's what we learned. This is the punchline. People who use lawn chemicals, people who have lawns, of all the people who have lawns that we surveyed, the people who put a lot of stuff on them are more likely to say that chemicals are bad for the environment, for their children, and for water quality than people who don't use them. I'll say that again. People who are using the chemicals say they're worse than the people who don't use them. What's up with that? And the answer is pretty simple. Any guesses? Yes. You got a guess? Go for it. They read the bags, They know. They are the one. Well, they're not the people. That's fair. Sometimes you're hiring a chemical company. I could go into this research, by the way. Who's more likely to hire a chemical company, a woman or a man? That's right. The women all hire companies. The guys are out there, digging around, rooting around in the insecticide. But that's for another time. The point about the research is to suggest that people know better, but they feel obligated to do it for a lot of reasons. Here's a quote from a homeowner we interviewed. I'll give you a moment to read what Suzanne had to say about her poor dog. I'm a dog owner myself. As you can see, the dog's allergic to the lawn chemical treatment, and in the spring when they fertilize, his paws get raw and they bleed. So for a couple of days after the grass is done, what did they do? Did they stop using these chemicals? No, they put these little booties on the dog. Suzanne is making a rational decision in a particular kind of irrational way. That is, she felt an obligation to do something with this lawn. And there's a lot of reasons for that. People talk about property values. They talk about their neighbors, a lot of pressure from their neighbors. I didn't have a lawn there for about 8 years when I lived in Arizona. But when I started this research, it was because some guy leaned over his back fence and said to me, you really ought to do something about that creeping Charlie, And I said, what the heck is creeping Charlie? I don't even know is that nice mint? The point, it has a kind of minty smell. So the point about this is that environmental education is insufficient in an Anthropocene. Environmental education isn't enough. People can have lots of good information, but they might still make what I would deem less than the best choices they don't even want to make. There are a lot of structural pressures on people to do the things they do. I'll come back to a conversation I had with somebody earlier. There's a context in which these things happen. That, I think, is a sobering lesson for what the Anthropocene is going to bring us. I'll give you a second research project I've been involved in for the last few years. This is an examination of faunal biodiversity and avian biodiversity, birds and critters, in India. Now let's take a look at the landscape in which these folks are operating. These are large populations of people living along a forest belt in northwest India. It's a beautiful country, but it's worked over. This forest was worked over first by the British, who deforested the heck out of the place. Then after independence, the Indian government hammered the landscape, and now people who live along the edge herd thousands of goats and sheep in this forest. They cut down all kinds of things for subsistence. They're hauling trees out of here. By the way, that's a hardwood. That is really heavy. Please do not try this at home. This shows you how hard it is to be poor. There's a lot of labor involved in being poor. And you can go through this forest and you see signs, in other words, Anthropocene signs, signs of the human impact. And what would you predict? You'd predict absolute devastation. Where are the critters going to live? This is, in other words, a classic example of, oh God, we're ruining the environment. And yet, when you start to count the species, you find there's an enormous amount of biodiversity. This is the Hanuman langur monkey here, enormously successful. I'll show you why in a moment. All kinds of migratory waterfowl. This is bar-headed geese flying in from Siberia all the way down to the tip of the southern part of India, coming through this area. You've got all kinds of weird reptile-y things, and you can see I'm not a zoologist. And then even the Indian wolf. This is one of the last breeding sites of the Indian wolf in India, and they're doing okay. And the leopard is doing especially well. Now, you won't see tigers, you won't see elephants, so it's not a sexy place for tourists to visit, but it's an awfully interesting, very biodiverse place where people are living. And why is that? We could get down in the weeds on this, but what happens is the way people are disturbing the land creates a patchwork of environments and ecosystems where animals can live. So when you're expecting bad news, you get a little bit of a silver lining. You get some good news. That's an Anthropocene lesson. It means that where people live and work does not have to be a desert. It does not have to be the end of ecology. Here you can see the langur monkeys night roosting. They night roost in trees typically, and that's so that they can get away from leopards. I am telling you, there is no leopard that is going to climb this power line that runs through the forest. They're incredibly adaptive. It doesn't have to be the end of biodiversity. This is quite a remarkable site. This is the first known night roosting, I should say, actually, of langur monkeys on high power lines. Whether their rates of cancer go up is another question. Let me give you one third research story, and I'll try to finish up about the Nelson Institute a little bit. This is a story of research that we've done in the Southwest on the transmission of West Nile virus, which is no joke. This last year in Dallas, the city found itself really trying to spray desperately to control the mosquito population. There were a few dozen deaths and many dozen, hundreds of cases actually, reported. And it's a disease that goes underreported. So the point about this is it's a serious disease, and where does it come from? It's mosquito-borne. Where do mosquitoes come from? In the Southwest, we're talking about Tucson, Arizona. What the heck are mosquitoes doing in Tucson, Arizona? It's a desert, right? Where you'd expect to find them is Miami and Wisconsin. I mean, you have those bird-sized mosquitoes here, right? Where are they coming from? Where do they breed? How do they live? They live in the city. They evolved in the city. They grew up with people over the last 10,000 and 20,000 years in cities. They're urban dwellers. They're really smart about the tiny, a Culex mosquito can reproduce in a paper cup. That's an mosquitoes, I salute mosquitoes. That's a remarkable species. Now the question is, where are they? So we spent some time mapping the habitats of mosquitoes and how cities produce them in particular kinds of places where drainages occur along here, and often it's not the natural features. Just I'll point to something. Along the right-hand side you see a highway, but you also see a river. That's a riverbed, it's a dry riverbed. And what you'll notice is where you see red, you're seeing large potential populations of mosquitoes. You don't see them in the riverbed. Where do you see them? You see them along the street edges where there are these drainages and culverts, and then all those little yellow dots, where are those? Those are in people's yards. Swimming pools. The guy from the health department guy from Reno who we interviewed said the population of mosquitoes boomed in Reno along with the disease risk after the economic downturn because people abandoned their houses, and when they abandoned their houses, they abandoned their hot tubs and their pools, and mosquitoes exploded, increasing the probability of the transmission of disease. So what's the point here? The point is that cities produce the hazard, but can you imagine building a city or reworking a city so it reduces the hazard? The answer is yes. I think we can think about cities as organic machines that produce risk, but can also produce safety from disease, that can thwart disease. If we rethink urban design with mosquitoes in mind for the future, particularly with climate change, which means a change in precipitation and temperature, very favorable, I might add, to mosquitoes in the US West, we can imagine cities that are more whole, where people can live, where the disease rate is low. And this is no joke because as bad as West Nile virus is, dengue fever is right over the border. That's a hemorrhagic fever that, you bleed from the eyeballs. It's very ugly. So, let me sum up. What we need, based on the research that we're doing, is to think about environmentalism and environmental research not only about conserving, saving, defending the last best places, which of course it should do, but also about creating the new best places. This is the Chicago wilderness here on the left. On the right, we have the converted train line in New York into a vast kind of walking garden. Has anybody seen this? The High Line? And then in the center, this is just here in the southern part of Madison. So what we're talking about is cultivating the environment all around us. Conservation is no longer just for Yellowstone. It's about everywhere we live all the time. And we can imagine building cities living in kind of different ways. The problem is, and here's why I moved here, it is not the case that every university or every scientific institution is ready to think about this. It is rather the case that we're going to have to change the way the university does business to address this kind of problem. So the Nelson Institute, and the reason I dropped everything, I can't even sell my house. I had to come to the Nelson Institute because it has captured thematically 4 key lessons about how the science is going to get done. And I'm going to close with this quick set of slides. It's got to foster discovery that is in no way resembles the science that was done 40 years ago. It can't be siloed into single disciplines. It's going to have to be interdisciplinary and largely synthetic. You know, people are going to have to speak each other's languages. And this is a real pain. You know, teaching a conservation scientist to speak social science language is really hard. But what I found actually is that conservation scientists don't even speak to climate scientists, you know, and we would think that they're all buddies. They go back into their back room and they, you know, shoot back some beers and they all speak the same language. This takes work. Discovery requires interdisciplinarity. 2, you've got to convene the public around the science. You can't be a science machine that produces knowledge and then just casts it out like magic dust. And everyone's going to absorb it and the world will be healed and transformed. You've got to bring the public to the university and say, what keeps you up at night? What are the problems in the northern part of the state? What are the problems in sand country in the middle of Wisconsin? How do we convene the scientists around the problems that people face? You've got to convene them. 3, you can't just speak science. You've got to be able to translate, which is to say, learn from and listen to the public in language that they speak and work with artists, movie makers, writers, journalists. Those are going to be critical to the scientific mission and not some ancillary appendage that solves the problems after the fact. The artists and the scientists have to be working together. That's not easy. And finally, you've got to be able to engage students in a different way. You've got to be able to take science students and scholarly students and students out of the humanities and put them on the ground. You've got to have them in communities. You need them in working gardens in Milwaukee. You need them up in the northern part of the state looking at the forestry conditions where working people who do not trust the University of Wisconsin are facing very real economic challenges. That's not easy. You've got to be able to engage them. So how do we do that? For discovery, we have 4 research centers, which includes a Center for Climatic Research, a Land Tenure Center, a Center for Sustainability in the Global Environment, and most importantly, I think, a Center for Culture, History, and Environment, all inside the Nelson Institute. That last one, the Center for Culture, History, and Environment, is unique in the country. It is historians, it is literary critics, it is filmmakers. They have a filmmaker in residence coming this year. This is inside an environmental science institute, a very unique combination. So discovery has to be interdisciplinary. I was going to give you a few examples of the kind of interdisciplinary research we do. I don't think we have time to get buried down in this, but I just want to point out that people like Tony Goldberg are taking a look at how West Nile virus is vectored, and he works with zoologists, he works with entomologists, he works with medical professionals to understand how the disease works, and he grinds up lots of mosquitoes, and what he finds is that the disease is resident in the population of robins throughout this region. The bird is where the disease lives from season to season. Work by Carol Barford, another Nelson scientist working with her colleagues, asked whether farmers can make money growing biomass for energy. Can they do it? Is it economically feasible, or is it a total boondoggle? That's actually an open question. And what she finds is that under certain conditions, under certain kinds of fossil fuel prices, for example, it can work. People like Steve Ventura, working in Milwaukee, are asking whether we can turn our cities into farmland or whether that's actually a utopian fantasy. And if in a place like Detroit, it's not a utopian fantasy. It's what people who have been abandoned by the economy are doing right now. Whole sections of Detroit right now are being farmed by people who've lived there for generations. The African American population predominantly is farming like crazy in Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee. We have to think about policy differently. Somebody like Greg Nemeth, working in interdisciplinary teams, energy and policy teams, asks questions about how to design policies for energy. My point about this over and over is that discovery is a little different when it's done at the Nelson Institute. When I talk about convening, that is bringing the public together. This is just a modest example. We conduct something called the Community Environmental Forum. I don't know if you've heard of it. Every semester we take on a controversial topic, and we bring the public to engage both the scientists and the policymakers and people from industry about it. And right now we're dealing with frac sand mining in the central part of the state. This is the sand that's being mined in really large quantities to feed the natural gas industry in Pennsylvania. It's a very interesting problem. It's extremely controversial. We try to engage in a civilized conversation. And this is only where we're starting. We would like Nelson to be the destination for engaged, scientifically informed, civilized discussions about environmental crises and problems at a national scale. We would like to see people coming to us from all over the country and maybe all over the world in the next 10 years. And in terms of translation, some of the things we do include a film festival called Tales from Planet Earth, which is a terrific international event where filmmakers from around the world come and show environmentally themed and environmentally oriented film. People from the public come. Most of the showings are free. Isn't that right, Steve? The showings are free and to the public, and so the idea is to connect artists and filmmakers with the scientific community, open to the public. And of course, our Earth Day event, I would only remind you, the one coming up in the spring, it'll be it's April. I should know when Earth Day is. We're going to bring Jane Goodall to campus here to speak. Please don't write it down. Don't miss it. Also, Celine Cousteau, for those of you who like fish more than chimpanzees, will be with us. This is a big event. It's one where we're seeking to engage the public. We're working with not-for-profits. We're looking out to local businesses who really, people like Kohl's and other kinds of businesses with a fairly solid green record who really want to engage in Earth Day. That's a translation kind of event. And finally, on engagement, our students, Community Environmental Scholars program, are students who come out of historically non-academic households, first generation, often underrepresented minority communities, people that you don't often see in environmental science or environmental studies, coming to campus, working in environmental studies, and then going back to their communities and engaging in problem-based research where they come from. So it means rethinking education on this campus. Service learning, dealing with the public, and thinking about the environment as something that people face every day, whether it's in Milwaukee or Detroit or South Madison. So to sum up, we are in for a very rough ride. This is like man meets nature, wipeout. We are in for a very rough ride in the next 50 years. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Some of the change that you're seeing is locked in. It is as inevitable as the sun coming up tomorrow, which I will bet on. So we'd better get ready for a lot of weird things that are going to happen. But we're in a position both to get in front of it and to adapt to it in ways that the human imagination can expand beyond any of the possibilities that it has in the past. We have an opportunity to think about a whole new kind of economy, a whole new kind of ecology. This is a great moment. I think this would be a much better moment to be coming to the University of Wisconsin than when I was a student, when really the environment only meant a disaster movie. Now we can think a little bit about modeling our behaviors on non-human species all around us and think about adapting to a very different kind of conditions, because we do not have a choice. We don't get to choose about this anymore. It's get with the program or wipe out. Thank you very much. Thanks especially to the Alumni Association. So I can take questions, is that appropriate?
Thank you, Paul. I'll come around the audience with the microphone so everybody that's watching online can hear all the questions. And if you're watching online, please send your questions to webcast@uwalumni.com.
Yes, I was wondering, are there other states, other governments, state governments that are doing the same type of thing?
Yeah, what a great question. The answer is yes,
Oh.
but only to varying degrees. There are a lot of different experiments going on. California, you know how it is. A complicated state, has always been a leader actually in setting certain kinds of environmental standards, and they are thinking very seriously, for example, about greenhouse gases. So there's an example of a state, but it's not the only one. Oregon, Washington, some of the usual West Coast suspects. But actually, as I mentioned, like the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, which is a bunch of cities getting together, there are regional climate governance groups. So sets of states in the Northeast, sets of states in the Midwest are getting together on these things. if we leave climate aside, if you think about something like phosphorus, which is stuff that's coming off of people's lawns and off of farms, it's loading up in Lake Michigan. You can't solve that just being Wisconsin. That's going to require Michigan, it's going to require all the states in the basin to get together to think about that. And so not only are different states starting solutions, they're beginning to work together in collaborations, and that's going to be mission critical. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
People have been talking like this for 50 years. And in the current climate, when we're still talking about growth, how can you be optimistic?
Well, let's be clear, I'm not optimistic.
Okay.
If that makes you feel better, I don't feel good. But I do think that facts on the ground have gotten in front of ideology this time. In other words, you talk about something like Sandy, and Michael Bloomberg came out and supported climate policy at the end of that horrific event. He was confronted with something that was too real to continue to tell stories about. And I think that that's important because there are a lot of ways you can tell stories and spin stories and control how we perceive different kinds of changes, but a lot of these changes are too real to ignore. The insurance industry has got the ear of policymakers more than the environmental community, and the insurance community is worried about the coast. So as I said again, maybe it's not the best way to get solutions started, but I think that right now the business community is starting to think twice about an entirely anti-environmental agenda. And when money starts, always follow the money. When money starts moving at a problem, sometimes it gets addressed. So my optimism comes from the fact that the world's changing too fast for people to stick their fingers in their ears. Now that could be called some kind of triumphalism, but it's not, because it's a very awful situation you find yourself in. There are people still without power and homes on the East Coast. But look at where the water came up to. I'll finish on this. Wall Street. And when the water rises on Wall Street, you start getting people thinking twice. Maybe different ways of investing in different kinds of energy sources aren't so crazy. So I'm not waiting for the business community to do this, but I am keen to think about how we can partner to some kind of future that isn't a total train wreck. That's the way forward, to try to imagine some kind of meaningful partnerships that can have traction and scale up. So I'm not an optimist, but I'm a pragmatist. Does that? Not very satisfying, I guess. 50 years, I know. 50 years ago, I wasn't born 50 years ago. Oh, sorry, there's one, we gotta go with the microphone.
I just wanted to mention about biotech crops, and everybody thinks of Roundup Ready, soybeans and that, and it's going towards a much different level. Things like drought tolerance, fungal tolerance, resistance to soil insects, which could shift things, which is happening to places like Africa, where they can't grow those things right now. And that would have repercussions. You read about BP with their cane sugar ethanol, but that's coming from Brazil. That's not coming from the US, but they never mention stuff like that. But those are the kind of things I think about at night.
Right, well, it's one of these sort of contradictions that the traditional environmental community has to face. That some of these technologies make things worse, and some of them can make things better, and usually they do both. So many kinds of genetic engineering of crops are very interesting effects. I believe the studies that suggest that the Bt cotton and Bt plants, that is a crop plant engineered to control pests without pesticides, has brought down the exposure of Chinese farmers to pesticides. They are living longer, better lives. The farmers I work with in India, they are taking genetically engineered crops, for better or for worse, and they're interbreeding them with their local crops. Now, my friends in integral ecology will tell you that we don't know how that's going to turn out. That may bite us back in a terrible way. But the fact is, these things are unfolding. And I think technology hasn't solved any of our problems, but none of these problems get solved without some kind of tools. So I guess this is a moment where we rethink some of our tools. Right now, I'm really into biodigesters. I just can't go anywhere without seeing a biodigester. These dairy farms in the southwest part of the state, they're all taking all that waste and they're turning it into energy. They're brilliant. They're way ahead of the curve on this. Wisconsin dairy, the new source of global energy. A very weird outcome. It doesn't happen independent of the technology, but the technology isn't sufficient. That help? Because I take your point. Yes. You got to wonder where it goes. We know where it goes. It goes to Lake Michigan.
Two comments. First, I think your presentation of knowledge was remarkable, and I liked your physical presentation. And I wish the audience could see how you move back and forth and shown with your hands and your body, your enthusiasm.
Thanks.
And secondly, back in 1990, my husband was the director of energy bioscience for the Department of Energy, and he was into the farmers utilizing their residue crops. And there was a lot of inter-organizational groups with this, National Science Foundation, NSF, DOE, and I'm glad to see that it's continuing, and I just know it will be a better world. I have optimism.
I appreciate your optimism. Well, so thanks for the first comment. Let me say something about DOE. The Department of Energy, long notorious for picking pretty dirty energy choices over the years, has also quietly, on the side, as a hobby, investigated a huge range of alternatives. That's where your tax dollars have been going, and often they don't pay off in 2 years. Sometimes it takes 30 years to bring a new technology to market, and that's why large companies don't invest in chancy technologies. The government does it. The universities do it. That's what's happening with the Wisconsin Energy Institute here. They're looking forward to what the next energy source is going to be. So what I would say is those examples of people toiling away on this stuff in energy in the 1970s and 1980s, 40 years ago, right? We're only seeing it now. One, because the economy is more ready for it, and two, because sometimes it just takes a long boil. We don't have that much time. Things are changing fast. I get it. But that's an important part of this is, you know, tell your senator to support the National Science Foundation. This is what I would say there, right? Those things pay off. Sometimes it takes a while.
Are we going to be doomed to drinking bottled water as a result of fracking? Are we going to lose all our aquifying rocks, the porous rocks that give us fresh water? Are we going to lose the Pinocchio Range? I'm registered at the Bad River, and I worry about that. Help me get better dreams. Better
dreams. Well, I'll tell you the industry's story, their happy ending story, which I don't necessarily endorse. The Nelson Institute does not endorse any particular political party or any particular technology, but I'll tell you what the industry says, and they're right about this, that the natural gas revolution as an alternative to coal has brought down the carbon footprint of the United States for the first time in its history, period, since the Industrial Revolution. The graph looks like this for carbon. And what natural gas has done, owing to fracking with all kinds of problems, has bent that curve for the first time ever. So that's what the industry will tell you, and they're right, that natural gas has a much lighter footprint. The price, locally, in terms of water quality, is an open question, and it could be a real bad deal. It could be a real bad deal. So that's something that requires, I would say, engaged research and some precautionary principle. That is, you don't just let anybody mine anywhere, but I don't think a solution to the problems of the future comes with relying on coal. So what alternatives do we have right now? And natural gas is one of those solutions that we have right now. So that's not an answer you'd like, I know that, but I would say about it that none of this can just stop with a particular industry, right? I mean, if we went to natural gas solutions, which are exciting, at the same time problematic, we have to imagine them as a bridge to something else. Fully solar economies, fully wind-powered economies, really light footprint kinds of alternatives. but they don't happen overnight. They haven't happened overnight. People have been talking about electric cars since 1972, and the natural gas fracking boom in 1 year changed the carbon economy of the United States. You may not like it, and I'm not sure I like it, but it shows you the incredibly transformative power of a technology and an economy overnight. And if we can imagine options that are that powerful, but not invasive, that are not as destructive potentially to water quality, then that's where we have to head. So that's a very politic way of saying, you know, the glass is only half empty. You don't like my answer. It's okay. That's all right. I appreciate the question, though, because I don't have an answer.
Do you find signs in your center that the corporate world getting upset with the potential loss of money by whatever is happening to the environment? Do they come to you? Do they want your help?
What a good question. The answer is yes and no. If you take a look at WICI, which is this Wisconsin climate change impacts assessment we did, it was geared very much around Wisconsin industries, where the Wisconsin jobs are, in areas like tourism and forestry. So we are providing and producing information that the industries want to know. But have they started knocking on our door yet in large numbers, writing checks to me and saying, help solve our problems? And the answer is not yet. Not yet, and not in large numbers, which doesn't mean that Nelson hasn't worked with firms or not-for-profits, the environmental community. We absolutely have. The science is engaged. But getting a relationship with the business community is a tricky one. It's a tricky one. But it's one that it's not going to go away. That's where the money is. And they have the problems. Let me tell you a story, a short story. We did some research in Montana. Montana, it is the state law that you're not allowed to regulate land use. That is the state law. One county in the entire state has zoning. Okay? So it's basically anarchy. It's lovely, it's beautiful anarchy. I mean, Montana's devastatingly beautiful. So what happens? Developers come into counties north of Yellowstone, and they develop the heck out of them. They build like there's no tomorrow, because they can. They're free to just build all the houses. Doesn't matter whether you're hurting elk habitat. It doesn't matter if you're blocking somebody's view. It doesn't matter if the night skies are going from dark to light. It doesn't matter, because they can do whatever they want. In the late 1990s, the developers looked around the landscape that they'd created, and they realized they were selling junk that can't make any money, because they destroyed the very thing that they needed to make money. So what did they do? They started loading up the planning boards in Montana and slowly beginning to self-regulate. Now, it's too little and it's too late, I would argue. In other words, by the time they've destroyed, by the time they've soiled their nest, there's no more money to be made. But if they can see the future, other counties, this is in Park County, which is north of Yellowstone, other counties further west, Beaverhead, all these other places in Montana are looking and saying, do we want to wait until it's too late? And I'm counting on the development community there to come to Montana State University and say, what are some reasonable rules that will maintain some of the habitat and the viewshed that we can impose upon ourselves, because the state refuses to regulate us? That's a lot to hope for, but I think that that's when they're going to start coming knocking. It's when the conditions of their own reproduction make it impossible to do business as usual, which is why Dow Chemicals is working to restore the wetlands of the Gulf Coast, because it's in their own best interest. And not every case is going to look like that. Environmental regulation is still going to have to control out-of-control behavior. And it is true that if that costs you any money, you are going to try to lobby against it. And if you have a lot of money, you might be successful. But at the same time, I think a lot of corporate leaders are looking at the costs associated with certain forms of development, and they are looking for alternatives. The answer to the question is, have they come knocking? That's a question. And the answer is, not yet, and I'd like to see it. I mean, I'd like to see that kind of engagement. What it would look like, I don't know. It's like an experiment. I have no idea how it would turn out. People are getting tired. It's late. Sarah? Oh, well, we can't. Pat? The microphone's coming. We got Pat here, and then...
Have you met Kathleen Falk?
Yes, I have.
Okay. She's one of our best ecologists. She ran for governor. She should have made it. But she's trying so hard to keep phosphorus out of the lakes. She's pushed manure digesters, all that kind of good ecology stuff, and I'm glad you know who she is.
Yes, I would say that the Nelson Institute does not endorse any particular political party or individual. But what we are trying to do is bring luminaries and thinkers from any part of the political spectrum who want to engage the campus to campus through Nelson. So Kathleen will be teaching a class to our students in the spring. And we'll bring other people onto campus as well. It doesn't matter what political party or whether they're from the industry or from the environmental community. We think that students need to be listening to people who are actually out in the community and not just a bunch of geeks like me, right? And so Kathleen is one of the frontier folks. She'll be teaching how change happens in the real world to students who want to make a difference. So there's that.
In his more or less acceptance speech, President Obama did bring up the fact that we are going to have to do something about the climate and being proactive and that kind of thing. I was just wondering, with everything else that's going on, do you have any feeling about that perhaps they will finally work a little bit on it and give you a little bit more help and direction, whatever you would call it?
So let me say a couple things. Whoever won the election, whether they liked it or not, as I've said in a recent editorial, was going to be the first climate president, whether they liked it or not. They were going to have to deal with forest fire changes. They were going to have to deal with coastal zone management. Doesn't matter who won. They were going to be a climate president. Now, what we've got is a president who has said some things acknowledging that climate change is occurring and that some part of it is anthropogenic, it's caused by people, and therefore through greenhouse gas emissions. Do I see a global greenhouse gas agreement? No. No, I don't. I'm a pessimist on that one. That's just too hard a trip to take. Having said that, if states or communities wanted to work with federal agencies to lower the phosphorus load in our lakes, when I got to school here, I'm an alum of this university. When I got to school here in the 1980s, the lakes were green and filthy and run over with algal bloom. And you know what they're like today? The same thing. So no progress, very little progress has been made here. This is somewhere we really need to move. If communities wanted to work with federal agencies, those would be federal agencies, I believe, that would have federal support under the current administration, whether for better or for worse, that can galvanize certain kinds of efforts between local communities and federal support. I don't want to say that that's enough, but what I want to suggest is that there are opportunities currently with the federal government which are quite interesting. Both candidates, just in defense of both candidates said, we're going to need research and development and universities to help solve these problems, and blessings upon both of them. They agreed that some of this stuff, needs people trying to solve the problem. So in defense of both candidates, this is an area they agreed. Whether or not you're going to see movement on climate change as a national, sign on to something, whatever follows, Kyoto, seems extremely unlikely, but never say die. There's definitely an opening to think about what we're doing. And again, I think that would have been true for almost any president. I think the events have gotten away from them. Chris Christie touring the Gulf Coast, not the Gulf Coast, but touring the coast of the eastern seaboard, he seemed pretty shell-shocked. And who knows, maybe they're likely to run him next. So I'm not a political scientist, thank God. Anyway, thanks, good question. I don't have an answer. I'm watching.
One more question. What's going to happen with that pipeline that there's been so much controversy about?
Ooh, that's a good one. So I can say that the Romney campaign was, the question is about the Keystone XL pipeline. So this is a pipeline that already exists, right? It's bringing petroleum from the tar sands in Alberta down to Oklahoma currently, where it's processed into usable petrochemicals and oil. What the extension is it drives that pipeline down to Port Arthur for export, international export, so it sort of feeds this outflow of petroleum. And there's a kind of little side trip that it's now proposed to take, which takes it through Montana, I believe, one or both of the Dakotas, Nebraska, and then back on into Oklahoma. And that is one that the president, when he was president the last time around, said needs more study, which is a way of saying, too hot to handle, not sure I want to touch it, don't know what to say about it. Sorry, where was that question? Was back there. So I don't know what we're going to see on the pipeline. He's balked. But to be honest, the current pipeline already exists, and the other half of the pipeline is already basically being built, which is going to go straight down to Port Arthur, which really means a lot of Canadian oil that passes right through the United States and then disappears to China, really. I mean, it's not like it stays around here. What can I say? I'll say this. Natural gas is so cheap now that it's almost looking like oil is off the radar. I mean, the economy changes so fast in the energy sector now that who knows whether that pipeline is even going to be viable in 5 years' time. We'll see what they do with the tax credit on wind energy, for example, and alternative energies. That would change the viability of certain kinds of decisions. So the answer is right now, the Obama administration, so far as I know, has said it needs more study. Is that correct, Steve? So that's it. They've basically punted the ball.
A few comments before I ask the question. For 20 years, I was a volunteer at the Field Museum in Chicago. And constantly on the weekends, or we had staff going to schools, constantly giving lectures, exhibits. I remember having Earth Day at the Field Museum. My question is, what are you doing with the younger people?
Great
for
question.
The younger people.
That's a great question. Okay, so let's back down the age ladder piece by piece. Let's start with what's happening at the university, and then we'll talk about K through 12. The interesting thing about what's happening in the university right now, and universities across the UW system, by the way, you know, Whitewater, Stout, Oshkosh, and definitely Madison and Milwaukee, is that students are coming to campus and they want a green education. And they want their campus to be green. So they are coming in. So for example, if you major in environmental studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which comes through the major of the Nelson Institute, if you're an undergraduate major, you have to major in something else. So you have to be a double major. That makes it very hard. A lot of students would balk at that. The major is 1 year old. We got 250 students in 1 year lined up. Now where the heck are they coming from? They're not coming, if the university isn't producing these folks, they must be coming out of a very different K through 12 environment. Although I remember, I was a member of the Super Sugar Crisp Ecology Club in 1972, so I've always been a little green. But I do think something's happened in K through 12. What the university has been good at is using some of its facilities, like the Arboretum, for education and outreach and to work with educators. That linkage is one I haven't brought up, but I think it's part of engagement, is that K through 12 connects more closely with the university campus. And what I would say is that the students are coming to the campus more interested in the environment than ever before. So something's going on in those schools. And at the Field Museum, for example, we got a lot of Chicago kids coming up into this university, and they come better informed than they did before. And these students, by the way, they're not the kind of students I remember in the 1980s. We were environmentalists, and that meant only that we opposed everything. That was what our job was to oppose stuff. And I still oppose a lot of stuff. I want you to know that, don't worry. But they also want to solve stuff. And I think that's interesting. So you're seeing engineering students. My father was an engineer, obviously. Everybody has father issues. Engineering students are coming to us and they're really excited. They want to think about green engineering, green chemistry. Green chemistry. Like that, those two words would have been unthinkable in 1985. They are blossoming on campuses across the country, and that's coming from a generation of students who are coming to the university from a transformed K through 12 education. What I know about K through 12 could fill a thimble. Everybody thinks they know about education policy because they went to school. That's the problem with people in education policy. Anybody who's gone to 10th grade thinks they know how to run education. So that's out of my territory is what I'd say. But I have seen a change. How's that? See, it's optimism. Come on. I think we're done. We have one more, please.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question, something I've never understood. Over the years of the Earth, there have been all kinds of changes. There's been an ice change and there's earthquakes, and it had nothing to do with a human being. They're just natural things that occur. So how can you explain all those? I mean, how do you explain the Ice Age? How do you, I mean, they tell me the Great Lakes were caused by the Ice Age. They tell me in the Sahara Desert was once an ocean. Now, how do you explain all that? And how are you going to prevent it? It's happening all the time. You have earthquakes, you have these things that happen. Sandy, I don't know if that was a cause of pollution or whatever it was. It's just a natural way that the earth operates. So there's all the things we're talking about. That doesn't mean I don't believe in global warming, but that's not the real answer to some of the things that happen to us, or there will happen to us.
It's a great point. So let me try to address it in three pieces, because you're dead right. There are all kinds of changes that happen without any kind of anthropogenesis, without any kind of human influence. Take a look at the Fukuyama disaster. What caused it? It was caused by an earthquake, which caused a tsunami, which overwhelmed a nuclear power plant. Nothing about phosphorus or carbon exacerbated the earthquake. Putting a last generation nuclear power plant on the coast of a seismically active location explains what happened there. Some very bad risk management decisions. So, returning to Sandy, because good point. Returning to Sandy, clearly we are dealing with sea level rise currently, even if you don't think that humans have anything to do with it. You're dealing with sea level rise somewhere in the, probably, I think it's, at this rate we're trending towards a meter, half a meter. That, all it takes, one storm that would have been innocuous, if you add a meter, you add a half a meter, you've lost most of Miami. Most of Miami lies within 1 meter of the sea. So the point is, whatever you think about anthropogenesis, that is, the human influence on the earth, we're in a very poor position to deal with the trends we are seeing, natural or otherwise, in the environment around us. And we're going to have to make some very practical decisions about drought, crop management, fire management, reworking the Forest Service. We have to think about the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Before Katrina, who the heck had ever heard of FEMA? And now they're like this rock star, dysfunctional rock star agency of the federal government. And they're real, and they're going to be necessary. Ask Chris Christie, ask Michael Bloomberg, ask the environmentalists, ask Dow Chemicals. FEMA is here to stay, some form of it. So the point I would make, one is change happens, but it can be exacerbated by bad decisions, like the location of Fukuyama. Two, our ability to get ahead of trends and changes that we do see, whatever causes them, is critical. And three, and I'll make this point now, I'm not a climatologist. If you add what's called the forcing function, that is the amount of heat that we're adding to the globe by trapping greenhouse gases that wouldn't have been trapped naturally, they're trapped because of the carbon that we've released into the atmosphere, which was historically bound up in the earth. If you add that to all the variability, it's like imagine taking waves of variability and then stacking, add 5, add 10. The amplitude of these changes is enhanced. So the opportunity and the likelihood of disasters changes depending on how much energy there is on the earth. So the answer to that is stuff happens. The earth is wicked complicated. All kinds of things are out of our control. And yet, some of the things under our control, apparently under our control, like our ability to emit carbon or other greenhouse gases like methane, apparently is totally out of our control. Ask anybody who's tried to regulate it. It can't be. People refuse to control it. And that means that we're in for a really interesting ride. Things that would have happened anyway can only be more energetic, can only be more. Now, let's say one last thing. There's probably some winners in global climate change. I think the Canadian wheat belt is where I would invest right now, if I were you. In other words, not everything's a disaster. Things just move around. It will not be the end of the world, but it will be a changed world, whether it's anthropogenic or otherwise. And if it's good enough for the global insurance industry, and if it's good enough for Dow Chemical, and it's good enough for foresters all over the US West, then it's good enough for me. That is, and to say nothing of my friends in climate science, we'd better be prepared. I guess that's what I'd say. It's a Boy Scout thing. Thank you very much. It's a good question.
Thank you, Paul. That was great. I just want to thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I want to also thank everybody that tuned in online this evening as well. Our next UW showcase is going to be February 21st here, and we'll announce that topic and speaker when we know it. But I just want to say a special thank you to Pat Cornwell for introducing Paul tonight. And thank you, Paul. That was wonderful.